Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wild Ones. For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to promoting native plants and natural and sustainable landscaping. If you are a member of Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones chapter or would like to become one, be sure to check our website, kalamazoowild.org, where you will also find links to our programs and activities. We also have a Facebook page. You'll also find the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to sign up for our seedling newsletter if you haven't done so already. We're always looking for enthusiastic volunteers to get involved. Our email address is info@kalamazoowild.org. We hope to see you soon at our in-person events or webinar meetings soon. I want to make a special mention that Wild Ones will be having a community plant sale on May 20th, 2023 from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., which will be at the People's Food Co-op. It is being featuring plants grown by Wild Type Nursery, and it's being spearheaded by several of our executive team members, such as the Vice President, Jason. With that, I will now turn it over to Paul, Alexia, to introduce tonight's speaker. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Jesse. Within the past couple of years or so, a number of us have tried to emphasize the importance of Doug Palamy's concept of the Homegrown National Park. Particularly notable in that regard is one of our members, Noelle Olson-Gorgon, an executive board member, and she has been pursuing her interests and will give us a talk on that in March. So I hope you can turn in and hear that. We're looking forward to it. Although not always specified clearly, implicit within the concept of the Homegrown National Park is the importance not only of growing native plants, but growing native plants representative of regional habitats. Over major periods of time, plants evolved to adapt to a particular type of soil, the microbes in the soil, the climate and moisture regime, and the other species with which they naturally grow in association. If we want to develop a homegrown national park, it's important to grow plants that naturally occur where we live and make sure that we grow those plants in association with one another in what are called plant communities. As with human communities, it's not only important who the inhabitants are, but the interactions that occur between them. In order to achieve this goal of our homegrown national park, it's important to us to have some awareness of the types and compositions of those communities. Our speaker this evening will address some of those issues and provide us with information about where we can learn more along those lines. Kim Chapman has degrees from K College, WMU, and a PhD in conservation ecology from the University of Minnesota. He has worked for the Nature Conservancy in Michigan and Minnesota, has taught college, and is a consulting ecologist currently employed by Resources Environmental Solutions, a firm that specializes in ecological restoration. He has worked around the country, but mostly in the region of the Great Lakes, the Midwest, and the Great Plains, compiling impact assessments, designing ecological plans at regional and local scales, developing policies and standards, and participating in regulatory permitting. Over the years, he has written a number of articles and is co-author of 2 books, one titled The Valley of Grass, won a Minnesota Book Award, and the other, Nature, Culture, and Two Friends Talking, is a collection of environmental essays. Without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Kim Chapman, who will provide us with information about plant communities, particularly those in our areas, and how we could use that knowledge in growing native plants and trying to grow plant communities. So Kim, I'll take it over to you. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here again at Wild Ones, making another presentation and virtually back in Kalamazoo where I spent so much time. Paul did a great job of introducing what I'm going to be speaking about today. And what I would add to that, I'll add in the first slides. I'm going to share my screen. This presentation started with a conversation between Paul and me. Paul said that he hoped that I could help you understand what an ecosystem is, learn a little bit more about them, and apply it to your work. What are we going to do today? We're going to learn how to recognize some different ecosystem types that are common in southwestern Michigan, how to identify those same types in your project area, and then how to use some reference materials to help pick the species to actually plant on your project. So the question, what is an ecosystem and why is it a good tool for planting native species, is probably first and foremost on your mind. To put it simply, and Paul already said this, it is a collection of plants, animals, and other life forms that live in a particular place, a specific environment. They're self-regulating because of their interactions. And the environment has to do with climate, soil, water relations, and landform. We'll get into all of those a little bit later in the talk. I love this phrase, art imitates nature. You may not have heard about this, or you may not have thought about it this way, but in fact, the art of ecological restoration is really an act of trying to imitate nature. And specifically trying to understand what will grow well in a particular setting and with what other species. If you look at the graph on the right, what you see is a moisture gradient from left to right, from moist to dry, and each of those curves represents a different species. You'll notice that each species has a peak abundance in terms of stems per hectare at a particular location along that moisture gradient. Let's take the middle of the moisture gradient. That species that is represented there does very well at that point along the moisture gradient because it has evolved in a mesic environment. Notice that all of these are bell-shaped curves. As you go to the edges, the abundance of each species decreases. That's because they are competing against other species which are better suited to growing and thriving and persisting at that location, either towards the dry end or the wet end. So this is a way of being able to ensure that the species you put in the ground actually will thrive and persist despite future change. Another reason Paul mentioned that you want to pay attention to ecosystems is due to those interactions. There are many bee flower interactions that we know some of, but a lot we do not know. Little halictid and andrenid bees, for example, are known to be to specialize on either spring ephemerals. In some cases, it's a genus like Erythronium or a family, Asteraceae. I'll point to some of the hemiparasitic plants, mostly in the Scrophulariaceae. Those species are known to form associations with grasses and sedges in the roots, and they do better when they have those root-to-root interactions. What ecosystems are in Southwest Michigan? This is the area we're talking about generally. And here's the list. We'll make this PDF available to you all after the show. And you can use this as a crib sheet to try to understand the variability. These are ones that you are likely to encounter. Some of them are rarer, but they are so interesting, I've included them in this list. So let's dive right into a description about each of these different ecosystems. Paul called them plant associations or plant communities. That is correct. But if you recall, the ecosystem is not just the plant association, but it's all of the underlying physical attributes of a particular location, as well as the animal life and other biota, fungi, which are protista, and all the other life forms in this one spot. So Michigan prairies, there are about a dozen types in the state. They range from dry sand prairies, like the upper left-hand photograph taken by Brad Slaughter of the Michigan Natural Features Inventory up at Newaygo, to a wet prairie on loam, the lower right-hand corner. Denny Albert took that photo along the lakeshore of, I believe this one is Saginaw Bay. The other two pictures are mesic prairies, photos I took when I was doing my master's work back in 1980. Thompson Road Prairie is a mesic prairie, and Petersburg Prairie is a mesic sand prairie. So those are just a few of the many types of prairies that exist. They are maintained by fire and grazing without some kind of disturbance on a fairly frequent basis, once every 3 or 4 years. These prairies turn into brushland and eventually into forest. The wetter the soil, the taller the plants. It's a general rule. You can see that in the dry sand prairie, how short those plants are. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have prairie cordgrass, flowering stems of which can be 6 feet tall. Typically in the midsummer, in the early summer, you get what are called cool season grasses. Warm season grasses come on midsummer, and the prairie changes dramatically over the course of a year. The other thing all of us know about prairies is how many plant species are in a square meter. They're a remarkably diverse habitat with lots of species packed into small spaces. Moving on to oak savannas. This particular example is an oak barrens, a dry, sandy type. The upper right-hand corner is from Newaygo County. Picture I took in 1980. Lower left-hand corner is Allegan State Game Area, another photo from 1980, right after a burn. And you can see the flush of lupin that came out. The year before, there was no lupin. And with that prescribed burn, the lupin came on strong. Notice how some of the trees have died. They were, lower branches were killed, and what didn't leaf out. In other places, the lower branches were simply burned off. Light is very important in this plant community. Typically, you have either patchy trees and shrubs, or if you have more of a closed canopy, like you have in the lower left-hand corner, or even more than that, you have oaks dominating and a broken tree canopy. So light gets to the ground. Consequently, you can have prairie grasses, sedges, forbs that need sun, or do fine in semi-shade under the trees or in the patches of oaks and shrubs. The one other type of prairie of savanna that was dominant in southern Michigan was called oak openings, but there are virtually none of those left because of fire suppression. The next type we'll talk about is a forest type, oak-hickory forest. The Michigan Natural Features Inventory calls this dry and dry mesic southern forest. Many of these used to be these oak openings, and lack of fire allowed them to grow up. They typically have a loamy soil. They're very fire prone because of the oak leaves. If oak leaves dry out, they carry a nice tame fire. You can manage it with a leaf blower and a rake. The canopy is pretty continuous, but I'll point out the crown of the oaks that you see in the left-hand picture, how open those are. That is a characteristic, open branching architecture of oaks, hickories, and a number of other species of oak forests. That lets a lot of light through to the ground. You can see on the right-hand side, all the light flecks on the ground. Those move across the floor over the course of a day, and it makes it possible then for plants that do fine in half shade to persist. There are some spring ephemerals, of course, but most of the plants are not spring ephemerals. And the place where we tend to see the spring ephemerals in all their glory is in beech maple forest. MNFI calls these mesic southern forests. Typically a rich, loamy soil because of centuries of leaf fall of these of plants like maples, tulip tree, ash, all of which have nitrogen-rich leaves, unlike oaks, where the nitrogen is drawn out of the leaves at the time of leaf abscission. Maples and there's a continuous forest canopy, of course, and 4 vegetation layers. There's a ground layer. There's often a shrub layer where a lot of tree seedlings are found. Then there's the subcanopy, the one just below the canopy, the young trees waiting to take over when an old one in the canopy dies. And consequently, in combination with the crown architecture of maples and the other trees, you have lots of leaf mass intercepting light before it can reach the ground layer. And that's in fact why you have spring ephemerals. They complete their reproductive life cycle before the leaves leaf out, because at that point it is so dark that most plant species, unless they're very well adapted to shade, just do not generate enough energy to carry out reproduction. The summer and fall herbs are just not showy. A lot of them are small white flowers, I would say. And that's why most people lose interest in beech maple forests after the spring ephemerals, and then they go out and start looking at prairies that are more interesting. Hardwood swamp and floodplain forest. These are 2 saturated wet community types. They're different from each other, but I've just lumped them here because they're both wet forests. They're the most common wet forests in Southwest Michigan. Swamps are typically in basins, whereas floodplain forests are in river valleys that flood, obviously. Saturated soil in swamp forests, you can see on the right, those pools. This is in the springtime, and often in the spring, there are lots of pools in swamp forests that dry up by the end of the summer and into the fall. Floodplain forests, by contrast, typically are flooded early in the year with snowmelt and rainfall, and only after a terrific series of downpours in the summertime might you get a floodplain being inundated. But in floodplain forests, that initial flooding draws down, and in some places where you have sand primarily, the soil can actually be quite dry. So floodplains are an unusual kind of community type. Canopy is continuous. The understory is often open. In the case of floodplain forests, the flooding, sometimes ice in the spring, actually helps to suppress the shrubs and the tree saplings. So you can often look through a floodplain forest. The saturated soil limits opportunities for trees and shrubs to grow beneath the shade in a swamp. And so that tends to make those a little bit more open as well. I think you all know the species that we find in these types of places. And something that's quite unusual is that often a few species dominate the ground. Ferns, wood nettle, touch-me-not, and so on. This is a plant community, ecosystem type that you won't see a lot of, but it's so cool and interesting that I thought I'd point it out to you. It's a hardwood swamp with conifers on a slightly different site. Conifers tend to be white pine and white cedar. There might be tamarack here or there. Yellow birch is often quite common in the hardwood conifer swamp, along with black ash at one point, lots of red maple. And again, often a few species dominate the ground. What's really interesting about this is how many tip-up mounds, creating what's called pit and mound microtopography that you see. It really makes it difficult because to walk around in these places, because the trees are so shallowly rooted, and when there's a windstorm, they blow over actually fairly easily. Shrub swamp, called shrub car by the MNFI ecologists, is an interesting community. It's a lot commoner today than it was 100 or 150 years ago, and that's because it has colonized many open wetland communities after they were ditched by farmers to make them drier so that they could get in there and hay them. Almost all of our wet, sedgy, grassy habitats were used as hay meadows by the farmers that settled Michigan in the early 1800s, and they were used that way right up until the 1930s, all the way possibly as late as the 1950s. Shrubs, when they colonize, because of the extra leaf volume, the leaf area index is much higher for a shrub swamp than for a wet prairie, for example. They evapotranspire a lot more water than just the herbaceous layer. And so they actually help dry out the soil to some extent. So once they get started, then they're hard at work making it more suitable to themselves by evapotranspiring more water. Great example of this is west of town, out on West Main, Kalamazoo Kalamazoo College's biological station out there has a wonderful example of a shrub swamp. The organic soil is always saturated, typical shrubs that you would expect to see, and under the shrubs are sedges, blue joint grass, forbs, and ferns. Wet meadow, this is the habitat that was so often used as a hay meadow. It's saturated muck to a loamy soil, and it was maintained by fluctuating water levels, perhaps in part caused by beaver. When the water is high, it kills the shrubs, which is good for a wet meadow. When the water draws down during a dry period, then bare soil is exposed, which allows the forbs and other plants to seed in and establish themselves and maintain themselves over time, because they don't live forever and they do need to seed in periodically to persist. A few species dominate: tussock sedge, other sedges, blue joint, reed grass, other grasses. The photo in the lower right is a sedge-dominated wet meadow with iris showing. These tend to have slightly lower diversity. The photo on the left, with many species that I'm sure you all recognize, is at the edge of an upland. It may have been disturbed at one point, which is why it's forb dominated as opposed to grass and sedge dominated. Marsh habitats are where the roots of the plants are underwater, and you find them in a lot of different locations. What basically matters is whether or not the roots are always covered with water. That will establish the kind of vegetation that you find in marsh habitat. Water level is maintaining this system. And like some of the communities I already mentioned, it's dominated by a few species: cattail, bulrush, burrweed, and so on. In the upper left, you can see iris, sedges behind the iris, maybe bulrushes, I can't tell. In the foreground, one of the Elaeocorus species, probably palustrus. And in the lower right, that's either cladium or a juncus, I can't tell. And farther out is a bulrush, soft stem or hard stem. So you can see it's just a few species tend to dominate the marsh habitats. The last two ecosystems I'm going to talk about are bog and fen, two unique ecosystem types in southwestern Michigan. Pretty rare, but super interesting. Bogs are in depressions, upper left-hand corner, and they tend to grow in from the outside to the inside over time, eventually becoming swamp forests. But early in their development, you have a ring of trees, then you have a ring of shrubs, then you have a ring of sphagnum moss mat, decadon maybe just before some open water in the middle. The sphagnum and the peat both resist intrusions of groundwater, and so these tend to be acidic sites fed by rainwater. That's why they're called ombrotrophic. Ombro for rain and trophic turning towards. On the right side is a fen, upper right. This occurs where moraines meet outwash valleys and groundwater is discharged over time thousands of years, building up a peat mat, which you see sloping down to the water on the right. And the groundwater keeps the site cool. Calcium and magnesium carbonates form. The peat decomposes faster than in a bog, so you get muck. Marl is a precipitate of calcium and magnesium carbonate on the surface, which is white and a characteristic of fens. You can see how diverse these places are. The two lower pictures, just marvelous, marvelous places. All right, everybody take a deep breath. That was a fast trip through Southwest Michigan's ecosystems. We're going to now dig into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, which is to actually try to learn how to investigate ecosystems in your project. So we talked about how important the site is, and some of the things that I pay attention to right away are soil texture. Is it sandy? Is it clayey? Soil moisture. Is it a dry site? Is it inundated with water in the spring but draws down by the end of the year? All of those things are clues as to how the plant community that you put there will be subjected to forces that, unless it's adapted to, it will not persist. We'll go to a website shortly that'll help you figure out soil texture and soil moisture. The amount of tree shade, another critical element to consider. If you've got over 50% of the ground shaded by tree canopies and other vegetation, tall vegetation, you probably want to try to gravitate towards forests and woodlands for your site. If you've got less tree shade, savannas can be planted. And even less than that, you can plant grasslands or wet meadows. A lot of people don't think about this, but slope position and direction are really important. Direction a slope faces is called its aspect. If you're at the top of a slope, you're going to dry out a lot more quickly than if you're at the bottom of the slope, because water, even in the soil, flows downhill. So it's leaving the top of slope and accumulating at the bottom. If you're in a valley bottom, chances are you may have a high water table. So that's always something to very much be aware of. If slopes are steep versus gentle, that can also affect the speed with which the soil dries out. And lastly, if you face north or have any element of a northerly aspect versus a southerly aspect at your site, that will make a difference as well. Northerly aspects tend to be cooler and moister, maybe even shadier versus southern aspects. So the driest places in Southwest Michigan would be the top of a steep slope facing south. And not surprisingly, there actually is a prairie type that is specific to that type of location, actually more southwest facing slope, because it's even hotter at 3 p.m. when the sun is striking that southwest slope. Also, take your cues from the surrounding plant life. There are lots of oaks and grasses, either on your site or adjacent, or in a reference stand nearby. Well, you probably had some kind of an oak forest or oak woodland, or possibly oak barrens or oak openings, some kind of open system, more light. If you have a lot of sedges and ferns, well, those typically are associated with the moister site ecosystems. Those three forest types I talked about that tend to be wet, the wet meadows, the wet prairies. If you have a lot of shade tolerant plants, that will tell you something. Do not try to plant a grassland if what you mostly have on your site are shade tolerant plants, unless you plan to remove all the trees. All right, so here are some reference materials that I find extremely helpful. I'm going to try to highlight. I don't think I'm going to be able to highlight. I'm going to start by pointing to a field guide to the natural communities of Michigan, the third one down. If you don't have that book, I would highly encourage you to buy it. It's a wonderful compilation, marvelous compendium of knowledge about all of Michigan's ecosystems. They call them natural communities, which was the Nature Conservancy's term for ecosystems back in the around 1978 when they first started thinking about these things. And of course, you all have a field manual of the Michigan flora. But those two resources are also available online. Down below are some other publications that are quite wonderful that I have used. I really love Michigan trees. I did not know Michigan shrubs and vines existed until I started preparing for this talk. I've always used the guide to, or the Ontario Shrub Guide, which is also quite marvelous. But all the other ones I have used quite often. And I just learned recently about the Prairies and Savannas in Michigan book by the Heritage Program Ecologist. So I'm going to ask for that for Father's Day. So let's go up and start our work. So the first thing I always like to do, and Gail, you'll have to tell me if this is not showing up, okay? It must be showing up because you're not saying a word. The USDA Agricultural Agency, Natural Resources Conservation Service, maintains this wonderful interactive website for the entire country. It's all of the soil surveys in the country that you can use to either download data or analyze areas. And I'm going to help you orient to this. You'll have the PDF when you're done. So you can just click on that PDF link that I just clicked on, and this is what you will see. The only things you need to worry about are the area of interest, the soil map, and the shopping cart. It's free, your tax dollars at work. The area of interest is your project area that you're going to map, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So you can zoom in by either double clicking or by drawing a little box. So I'm going to zoom into my alma mater and Paul's place of employment for many years, Kalamazoo College, which I believe is right there. Yep, there it is. I'll zoom in just a little bit more. Okay, so we have, there's Mountain Home Cemetery. This is a nice reference stand, we call them, for what the canopy would look like of whatever this habitat is, and we'll find out more in a moment, except for all the trees that flew down during the tornado. So we're going to now use this little button right here, AOI, Area of Interest, to draw a polygon. And this is our project area. So you just click once, click when you want to move, when you have a vertex you want to put down. There's another one. There's another one. I think we're taking in some people's houses, but that's okay. Go past the Stryker Center, down level to the railroad tracks, past the Dairy Queen. There's the natatorium. Now, when you get to the end, you're going to double click. There we go. And you will have success if you have a hatched area that identifies your area of interest. Great, so we're there. Now, the next step is to go to the soil map. Map loading, good sign. You can see the faint green line, that's our area of interest. And these orange lines represent dividing lines between soils types that the NRCS soil scientists mapped. This one here is UB. This one here is, you can see right in the middle, UOD. And there's another UB over here. There's a legend that popped up. About 30% of our site is urban land, and about 70% of our site is the urban land Ashtamo complex, a mashup of urban land plus the Ashtamo soil series. You can click on the Ashtamo soil series because that is in an area where we would love to see an oak savanna restoration take place here on the quad, around the chapel, and on the north side of Trowbridge Hall. And up pops the description. There's the urban land complex name. A portion of it is urban land, but the portion we're interested in is the Ashtamo soil series. First thing you want to go to is what kind of soil texture do I have? I have a sandy loam. The A horizon is the top layer with a lot of organic matter. It's darker. The B horizon is just below that. And the A and B together are where most of the roots of all of our plants are. The C horizon is just below that, and below that is the parent material. Notice it says we're on a moraine. Yep, that checks with what we know of the place. 12 to 25% slopes, correct. How deep before we hit a restrictive feature, which is either the water table or bedrock, over 80 inches. The drainage class, it's well drained. There's a very well drained, a well drained, poorly drained, and a very poorly drained class. All of that is explained if you just hunt around on this site. The water moves really fast, 2 to 6 inches an hour, so it dries out very quickly. The other two things that might be of interest are the hydrologic soil group, A, B, C, and D. A is the absolute driest group. D is the wettest group. And is it a hydric soil? No. So starting to gather information on the site, but what we're going to do now is go to the shopping cart and print out a report. You could have printed that out. That was print. You could print it out, but if you have multiple soil types, then you want to actually print out the report. So let's call this Kalamazoo College soils. I don't include the how soil surveys are made or the references. It just uses up extra paper. So then we go to checkout. Do we want it now? Yes. It's loading. And here comes the report. There it is. So all those things that we did, there's the area of interest. Here's the legend. Whoops, we missed the legend, but it was back there somewhere. Oh, there's the soils map. Next comes the legend. There it is. And then the descriptions are down here. So all you hit is the download button right there. I won't do it now, but you hit that, you'll have it on in your download site. You can print it out. You can just look at it online, whatever you want to do. So we learned an awful lot by looking at the web soil survey. We know the soil texture, we know its topographic position, we know how dry it is. Now let's say we've been on site and we say, well, we've got white oaks, couple blacks, a lot of reds. Somebody planted a beech tree for some reason. We might have a couple of other species out there, maybe a hickory or a walnut. But everything is mowed, so we don't know what's on the ground cover, in the ground cover. So let's go check out what might have been around. You could go over to Mountain Home Cemetery and poke around and see what plants are growing in the ground layer. But let's go to this site first. If you get this sign in, just hit cancel. So what we have here is a remarkable resource. This is the Michigan Vegetation Circa 1800 viewer. It allows you to locate yourself over here on the left and then identify the plant associations or ecosystems that were present in the first half of the 1800s, not to recreate these, but rather as a reference and a guide for what might work in the vicinity of your project. So a couple of things to pay attention to. By the way, this was done using General Land Office vegetation notes, which the surveyors platting out the land for sale were required to take, along with soil data and topographic data. MNFI ecologists did an incredible job. This is probably the best example of this in the entire country in my experience. They just did a fantastic job. So we have over here a legend of the different ecosystems that match these colors. This is a sliding scroll bar that'll let you move back and forth so you can see where you are, Traverse Bay, Little Traverse Bay, and see that, oh, it's all this northern hardwood deciduous forest type, that light green. You can grab it and move it. We want to get down around Kalamazoo. There's Kalamazoo. You can zoom in here, or you can use the little scroll device on your mouse. So I'm using the scroll device to get close to Kalamazoo College. There it is. It's showing up right there. I'll scroll in just a little bit more. That's probably close enough. So watch what happens when I move this thing back and forth. There is the Kalamazoo River. It was all some kind of a swamp forest along it. There's Portage Creek. We're coming up on Portage Creek on the east side of town, and lo and behold, what is that color right there? I don't know. So we're going to go over to the legend and find that color. Oh, it's wet prairie. Do you mean to tell me Portage Creek had wet prairie all along it? Yes, in fact, it did. And then as you enter downtown, we encounter this pale yellow color that continues west. There's Kalamazoo College, part of Western Michigan's campus, and going way out into the neighborhoods to the west. But one of the challenges of using this is you can't really tell sometimes what color you're looking at here. So I do this, I minimize the sliding view pane, and I bring my my type in question close to the legend so I can match. Paul and Gail helped me figure this out the other day. It is mixed oak savanna right here, extensive areas of mixed oak savanna around Kalamazoo College and in downtown Kalamazoo. So you just minimize that and bring that scroll bar back out if you want to reimagine, if you want to do any more investigations. Okay, so we've learned that mixed oak savanna, which in the case of Michigan meant oak openings primarily, was a dominant ecosystem in this vicinity. The details, of course, depend on what's on the ground. So once you have that information, then you can move on to this wonderful document and begin to put it all together. This is the Michigan Natural Features website. The book I mentioned to you, the 2015 publication, Natural Communities of Michigan, basically is reproduced here online. What you want to do is go to the Natural Communities tab, click Communities by Name and Group. That will bring you to the list. And we are talking about oak openings right here. I'm going to click on that. And note that it's got a wonderful summary here in the very beginning, known primarily from historical literature. That's because it's pretty much extirpated from the state. But some of the things that are notable is dry mesic loams, yes. Well drained is something else you'll see. Moraines, there's that word. So we know we're on the right track. This map here tells you whether it was common. The dark green means it was common, prevalent on the landscape. There are photos here that you can look at, but there aren't a lot of examples of oak openings because they are so rare. Additional information here in terms of the landscape. Soils well drained, yes, sandy loams or loamy sand or loams, slightly acidic to neutral pH. You can in your site buy a soil probe. They're very cheap. Forestry Supplies sells them. It's a lot of fun to do a soil boring and lay that out and look at it and figure out how to get the soil texture and check the soil moisture. Information on the natural processes, the vegetation. Something you'll want to pay attention to is the dominants. The dominants are the things that will do best if planted. Also the common species, common shrubs will do best if these are the ones you plant. The ground layer, diverse array of graminoids. I think these are the common ones, but they may include some of the rarer ones. You don't necessarily want to start with your rare plants because they're hard to grow, and I'll get to that in a moment. The individual species then are listed by type: grass, graminoids, grasses and sedges, the forbs, your ferns, your woody vines, your shrubs, your trees. Animals, rare plants, rare animals, management considerations. Really important concept. And then at the very end, you can download the abstract. So I'll click on that. So here's a PDF that reproduces a lot of the information we just read, but adds a whole lot of detail. All the same categories, but much more detail. Just hit download, and you'll have a PDF of that you can either print out or just save on your website. So I'm going to close this out. All right. Well, we've done an awful lot of investigation in the last 20 minutes. And so let's put it all together. Let's pick the right plants. We're going to pick the plants that will do best for our site and in which vegetation and in the particular vegetation layer. So the things you want to pay attention to: what are the dominants in each of these layers? If you already have a canopy, great. Then you're just working on the shrub, vines, and herbaceous layer. Also, I mentioned the common species. This is really important. Which ones will establish early on? A lot of us don't realize this. Paul does, but there is a successional process in all plant communities, all ecosystems, whereby there are species that do well when the soil microbiome is in a certain condition, the result of agriculture or some kind of above ground disturbance or simplification of the plant community. And over time, it becomes more suited to species that really don't make it in that early successional habitat. So this conservative index of conservatism is the phrase. We can find that on Tony and Ed's site right here. Get the new website because it has just marvelous new maps that actually map all the specimens. So let's look for a plant. Let's say I really want to plant on Kalamazoo College's campus one of the Baptisias. Let's go with cream wild indigo, one of my favorite plants. The index of conservatism is a 10. It's a 1 through 10 scale, with 10 meaning it only grows in association with a lot of other plants that only grow together in highly pristine locations. So that might not be a good plant to try to get established early on. Instead, you might want to start with a CI of, say, 4, 5, 6, or 7, maybe. And let's leave the 8, 9s, and 10s, many of which anyway are endangered, and you need a permit to collect seed of anyway. This next one here is also really good. It's the coefficient of wetness, a 1 through 5 scale, with 5 being really dry and 1 being really wet. So this one would do really well on a west-facing slope, right next to DeWaters, overlooking Lovell Avenue. That's where I would put this plant if I wanted to do it. But I'd have to make sure it's going to make it over time. I may have to baby it along. And that's, what are the conservative species you want to plant later as succession proceeds? Just a couple more words, and then we're done. At what density should you plant live plugs and quartz of herbaceous plants if you're going with live plants? What we are finding works quite well is to go with a smaller size, 32 per flat live plug. They're like 1.5 inches or so, maybe 2 inches in diameter. And you put them on 9 or 12-inch centers. It's the lowest cost material. You get quick coverage after one full growing season if they go in early in the spring. They expand, they grow over that year if you dose them with a little bit of phosphorus maybe. if you're low in phosphorus. I would test the soil though before you do that. Um, Quartz, a little more expensive, but they also can have a big impact right when they go in the ground. 12 or 18-inch centers. We are not finding the gallon plants are efficient, and they are expensive because you have to hold them over an extra year, typically to get them sized up to the gallon size. The nurseries lose plants in that year, and that's why the prices are so expensive. If you're going to seed, 40 to 60 seeds per square foot will do it. If it's a really diverse mix, that'll get you $1,600 an acre, maybe more, 1,800. If it's a really low diversity mix, but basic, and you're going to bring stuff in over time, you're going to be in the $500-600 range. I have designed $400 mixes for certain clients that want that, but they're not really pretty mixes in my opinion. And with that, I'm ready to start taking questions.
So Kim, we have a number of questions that have come in the chat. And so I'm going to start with the first one that came in and let you see what you can do. So the first question comes from Cheryl, who is interested in which ecosystems do you typically find ferns in?
Mm-hmm. The bogs have a lot of ferns. The hardwood swamp has a lot of ferns. The hardwood conifer swamp has a lot of ferns. Those three, I would say, are very high in fern abundance. The next level would be maybe floodplain forests, some of the moister areas in floodplain forests. Wet prairies are in that same group, a little bit more ferny in a wet prairie. You tend to find them quite sparse when you get up into all of the drier ecosystem types.
Thank you. Next is a question from Ed and Marcia, who are interested in if you're doing all of this planting, how do you tell which plants may be most resistant to wildlife, such as deer?
That's a great question and a really important one to ask. There are lists of deer-resistant plants. We know that deer are attracted certainly to liliaceous species in the Liliaceae for some crazy reason. They love those plants. They'll also nip off sedges in the spring. But there are lists of species that deer tend to avoid. In addition to that, you can try to protect your plantings in a number of ways. Fencing is expensive, but the most effective. There are various deer anti-deer scents that are available. Unfortunately, after every rain, you have to put them back out. You also can get to know your deer's habits. They are most starved for your plantings after a long winter. So springtime, really important for deer to find fresh vegetation. And unfortunately, they tend to gravitate towards young plants. If you're putting in trees and shrubs, they will work on those over the winter. Some shrubs they won't touch because they don't like the taste, sambucus, for example. Other shrubs they'll just devastate. The other thing to consider is putting out other food for deer. Yes, it attracts them, but if you were able to have, for instance, a corn patch, let's say you have 2 or 3 acres and can afford to put a corn patch out or an alfalfa patch out, the old spent corn will keep them busy. The alfalfa greens up very early in the spring. That'll keep them busy and maybe away from your plantings. A lot of random facts, but I would just basically go find that list. They do exist.
The next question comes from Heather. Looking at black ash swamp category, What's the current guidance on replanting ash trees in Southwest Michigan?
Holy smokes, that's a great question. I've frankly never thought about replanting, so I'm going to have to put on my ecologist hat and ponder this for a few seconds. Um, the the one thing we all know is that we've lost an awful lot of ash trees, which means that the densities of the borer are probably a lot lower on the landscape than they were when southern Michigan was completely blanketed with green ash. That really helped spread that borer across the state. The white ash, who knows if it would ever have found the white ash scattered around in the beech maple forests. Um, if it hadn't been for green ash dominating so many locations around the state. Now that the borer has passed through and done most of its damage, maybe it's possible to plant at a very low density some of the ashes back into the forests. But you cannot create an attractant. You have to be sure there are no borers in the vicinity. So if you have a dying green ash, you should go cut it down and burn it to eliminate the borer from that green ash. Make sure there's no other ash trees around, I would think, because then that becomes a source population that could spread out because they're so abundant even in one tree. It's amazing how many larvae can infest one single tree and all turn into winged critters the next year that go out and find other trees. So I guess to some, I'd say if there are no other ash trees around, they've all been killed or cut down. And if you plant very sparsely at low densities and then observe what happens, that's critical. Practice adaptive management, make your decision, do your planting, but then observe and make a modification to your plans if you see that, well, in fact, they're finding all our ash trees. We got to go to plan B, whatever that is. Is that a treatment with chemical, the way they've been doing around the base, or an inoculant of some kind, or getting a hybrid that is more resistant?
Okay, we have, I think, 2 more questions in the chat, and then we'll have to wrap this up. Jason wants to know, can soil type change over time by inputs of organic material, vegetation, erosion, etc., or does soil type remain constant?
No, you're exactly correct. Soil type changes over time, typically due to 2 factors. One is human use. Erosion is the most obvious change. Loss of the A horizon, that organic rich A horizon. You can see that in the tops of all sorts of ag fields all over southern Michigan. They're pale. The dark A horizon is washed off down into the bottoms, the low points of the farmer's field. Addition of organic matter definitely can change that. You can do in cornfields, for example, cover cropping that when worked into the soil increases organic content of the soil actually fairly rapidly. And just planting cornfields into perennial grasses, like with the CRP program, within 5 years, you begin to see profound changes in soil chemistry, organic matter. So yes, soils can change over time, and people can make them change for the worse or change for the better, depending on what they do.
Okay, a final question. Thomas would like to know, given that climate change is happening quickly, what species might you plant that are not typically native, but might be adapted to the future conditions that we see approaching?
So I'm going to have to infer from Thomas's question, when he says not native, he means not indigenous to southwestern Michigan, because I don't think we want to put anything from China into our plantings. So by non-indigenous, if you mean non-indigenous, Thomas, the way to do this is to develop a list of plants whose ranges are just a little bit south of southwestern Michigan. So say central Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. And whatever those trees are, or shrubs, or herbaceous plants, I mean, you'll have to go to the plant species distribution maps that the botanists have for those states. Whatever seems to be at that location, the north edge of that range, you could then consider those species as a species to plant and basically start the process of leapfrogging the distribution northward, which is going to happen eventually anyway. And instead of taking 50 to 100 years, you're going to try to accelerate it in 5 to 10 years, perhaps. You'll also have to consider about the ethical and practical issues around that. If you think of black locust, for example, that's east in the Appalachians and down in the Ozarks. We brought it north, and it is now a problem because somehow it filled a niche that none of our natives filled, and we find ourselves having to cut it all the time. So you have to be very, very careful about which ones you're considering to start to plant in advance of its natural progress northward.
Thanks very much, Kim. I'm going to turn it over to Jesse for thanks for your presentation and to talk a little bit about some things upcoming. Thanks very much. It was a great presentation.
I'm very happy to have been able to share my knowledge with you, and hopefully that PDF and this talk today will give you all a chance to deepen your knowledge and practice becoming a deeper ecologist. Take care. I'm gonna sign off.
Oh, I was going to say, I finally figured out how to unmute myself. I wanted to say thank you so much for such an informative presentation. And I wanted to, again, remind everyone of our plant sale that's coming up at the People's Food Co-op on May 20th. Again, it's being spearheaded by members of our executive committee, specifically Jason. And thanks again to Gail for keeping me on track and keeping everybody on track. So with that, our next meeting will be February 22nd. It's Designing Native Plant Gardens, Minimizing the Error in Trials and Error, which I've done many, many, many times. It'll be by Mike Weiss, owner of Drop Seed Native Gardens and Ecological Restoration. That will be at 7 p.m. at Zoom. And Mr. Chapman, I want to say thanks again, because while you were speaking, I was taking notes, and I've made a lot of errors in the past, so this was really good, especially the map. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Good luck, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.